Welcome to session number 3 of our discussion of archaeology in the Bible. Up to this point, we've been speaking in fairly general, broad terms about both archaeology and the Bible, but now we're going to start to try and focus in a little more closely on particular portions of the biblical text and particular time periods. We're going to start off in the beginning with Genesis and the Patriarchs. And when we talk about the Patriarchs, we're generally referring to Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Joseph, pretty much everyone from Adam right up to the time of the Exodus. So the format we're going to try and follow from this point on is going to be fairly standard between the time periods. We want to talk about some of the problems with the particular text and time period of the particular session that we're studying. The patriarchal period is particularly difficult, perhaps in one fashion, and I never really thought about this until I studied a little deeper. But the story of Genesis, for the most part, is the account of a single extended family that is kind of living out their lives. They're living. They're trying to make their way through life. They're getting married, having children, and dying. So we're not necessarily talking about great nations. We are talking about essentially a family. And really, one of the challenges to keeping track of this family, or really any of the families in this time period, for the most part, is the nomadic footprint. There was a great deal of nomadic pastoralism at this time frame. So, what you see in Genesis, we're told that the family of Abraham were pastoralists. That means they're really making their primary living from livestock, particularly sheep and goats. You see here that sheep and goats are generally fairly destructive of their grazing fields. They tend to browse very close to the ground, and in some cases will rip out the grass or the plant life by the roots, which generally means that they will destroy an entire grazing area, unlike a horse or a cow. And if you remember this from the history of the American West, you found that the cattlemen and the sheep herders were always in conflict with each other for this very reason. So when the livestock that you have, if that's sheep and goats, are destroying the grazing fields, then that forces you to relocate regularly, which leads to a nomadic lifestyle. Now, again, you're going to see nomads living basically in tents, and so they're not going to leave much in the way of material culture for archaeologists to find. They're going to travel very lightly. They're going to have few really durable possessions. And so we won't find a lot of buildings and pottery and things of that nature. So let's talk about writing a little bit. Really, what does the Bible have to say about writing? Well, in the book of Exodus itself, we have this command of the Lord to Moses. It says, "And Moses wrote down all the words of the Lord." So writing down the account is very important in terms of the biblical text and the biblical accounts. And this was very problematic because scholars were pretty much unanimous in the fact that maybe the Egyptians and the Mesopotamians had writing as far back as, say, 3000 BC. There was absolutely no written form of Hebrew until about 1200 BC. And depending on your time frame, that's going to be maybe 500 to 800 years after the assumed time of Abraham, and probably at least 200 to 300 years after the time of Moses. So how was Moses writing this down if there was no written form of Hebrew? And this really called into question also just how reliable these oral traditions were. We talked about this a little bit in the last session in terms of the documentary hypothesis and the later stage of the writing of the Pentateuch. But in reality, if an oral tradition goes long enough, it's usually going to deviate. So there's great value to having things written down to make sure that they get transmitted effectively. Now, as just an aside, let's also remember the things that we know from the biblical text. Even if we have question about written Hebrew, or whether there even was such a thing as written Hebrew at the time, let's remember that Abraham was not, in fact, a Hebrew. There really wasn't a nation or a tribe of Hebrews at the time. Abraham was from Mesopotamia. And so he would have been a native Akkadian speaker. He probably would have written in Akkadian. He would have picked up some Canaanite after he moved to the area. But so it's not unreasonable to expect that perhaps the earlier portions of the Pentateuch that Moses drew from could very well have been written in Akkadian. That's supposition on my part, but it is not an unreasonable expectation. So let's look a little harder at the writing. Last session, we talked about this Proto-Sinaitic or Proto-Canaanite writing. This is really a language that's the precursor to Hebrew. Now, if you were like me and in your high school history class, you were told that the Phoenicians were the ones who invented the alphabet, what we actually find now is this particular script that we see in the slide predates the Phoenician alphabets by several hundred years. This is a Semitic system that's been developed from Egyptian hieroglyphs. So a lot of these symbols kind of are a bit of a pictogram, but they are actually letters that have sounds associated with them. And these particular inscriptions, which were found in the desert in Sinai, just outside of Egypt, have been dated to somewhere between about 1850 to 1500 BC. So much earlier than was supposed. Also, what we find, and this is a relatively recent find in the last 10 to 15 years, you find this ostraka, which an ostraka is a broken piece of pottery that is then used to write on. So you have this ostraka that was found in a high official's tomb in Egypt that has been dated to right at 1430 BC. And what you see is this was actually a primer. It was basically a practice tablet for a scribe who was learning to write with this Proto-Sinaitic or Proto-Canaanite type writing. So now everyone who's read through Genesis 5 remembers that there's a very large number of begats, lots of people begatting other people, but there's also some extremely long lifespans. And this is problematic for a few different reasons. One, in this day and time, and we're going to assume that in their day and time, people don't live for hundreds and hundreds of years. That is not common. Well, it's not even so much not common, it's unheard of. And also because people love to do the math, when people start to work backwards from known points in the Old Testament, and they use these numbers from Genesis 5, it pushes our time frame on some of the characters in the Old Testament accounts to places that just don't make sense. So if you use the literal ages in Genesis 5, you end up placing Abraham sometime in about the 2200 to 2000 BC time frame. And remember, we've used 17 to 1800 is kind of our assumed point, but this pushes it much earlier than that. And the main reason why that is a problem is because then we look in Genesis and it tells us that Abraham visited Salem. Abraham visited all these different cities, and archaeology tells us that in many cases those cities did not exist in the 2200 to 2000 BC timeframe. So very much of a challenge if we're going to interpret the Bible as historically accurate. So here's a nice chart here that shows these lifespans kind of stacked on top of each other, and it shows some interesting things. It shows that Noah's son Shem would have pretty much lived. It would have died right about the time that Abraham was still alive. So there's a huge amount of overlap here that really doesn't seem to come out in the biblical text itself. We do know from looking at skeletons from ancient times that the average lifespan of an individual was somewhere between 30 and 50 years. And there were, on occasion, some unique individuals who might live as long as 90 years. But at this point, the archaeology has shown us no 200 plus year old skeletons. Skeletons are individuals that lived that long. We've not found those. Now, to be fair, we talked last session about not reasoning from the negative, so we can't say it's absolutely out of the question, but we have not found evidence that supports it. However, from the Sumerian king list over in Mesopotamia, in modern day Iraq, we have found these accounts of kings who were ruling for up to 36,000 years, and these long ruling kings came before the flood, and they talk about a flood as well, and we'll cover that here a little bit later on in this session. But you had some extremely long reigns of kings in Samaria. Now, for the longest time, this was believed to be just mythological, made up, fanciful type writing, until one of the kings who was listed on this king list was found, confirmed by several inscriptions as being an actual person. And this particular king is shown on the list as having ruled for more than 900 years. So that becomes very much of a challenge to what we're looking at. But we discussed this last session. We have to be careful of bringing our own 21st century outlook into accounts from the ancient world. One thing we find from several of the societies in the ancient Near East, Mesopotamia being one of them, quite a few of these cultures were noted for giving honorific type ages. So if you were an important person and you performed some great deed, they would basically increase your age based on how great this deed was, or what your position in the tribe or in the community or in the nation was. The king would always have a greater age, so forth. If you were the patriarch of the tribe, even if you were younger than other people, you would be considered to be the oldest. And this would have been a thing that was well known to the people of the day of that particular time, not quite so well known to us. So it is conceivable that we are misinterpreting this particular age span, both in terms of the Sumerian king list and also perhaps in regards to Genesis 5. Now, some of these Mesopotamian societies also used a base 60 numbering system. And so if you start to divide some things by 60, maybe some of these numbers make a little bit more sense even. Definitely doesn't address the whole issue, but it does bring it into a little bit better standpoint than looking at Methuselah being 969 years old. Is that conceivable? Is that possible? Well, with God, all things are possible, but we know the way the world normally works, and that doesn't seem to be borne out in the world we live in today, at least. If we take some of these more, we'll call it quote unquote reasonable ages for the patriarchs, ages that are more consistent with ages we see of people today, that pulls Abraham back into a standpoint where we're talking about 17 to 1800 BC, which puts him in the Middle Bronze Age, and that lines up with the archaeology pretty nicely. All the different cities he was supposed to visit are actually all there, and then when you start adding on to that the patriarchs afterwards, it starts to line up reasonably well with our assumed chronologies. So is it definitive? Is it ironclad? No, but it does make a certain amount of sense. So if you remember in the past session, we also talked about synchronisms, historical synchronisms, where the accounts in two different cultures or societies find a point where they sort of cross, overlap, or at least correlate with each other. One really noteworthy synchronism we see in Genesis is the flood account. Now, the story of a great flood is not unique just to the Hebrew Bible. We have here the Atrahasis account, which is an Akkadian form that comes from approximately about 1700 BC. In this particular account, there is an ark involved. The ark is circular. It's not like a normal boat, but there is an ark, and there's even an effort to put animals on the ark to save them from the flood. So there's a lot of parallels there. A few noteworthy differences, but some definite parallels. Also, we have the Epic of Gilgamesh, which is a Sumerian form from about 2000 BC. And it is an account of Gilgamesh having a conversation with the Sumerian Noah, who was warned by the gods that they were going to destroy the earth, and so built himself a boat and survived the flood. Now, there's a great deal of discussion as to whether these accounts came before the biblical account or came after the biblical account, whether one was copied from the other. You can argue the points as much as you like. Another possibility is they could all be accounts of some historical event that occurred in the past that all of these societies were aware of. And again, there's a great deal of discussion about the extent of the flood. Was it a worldwide flood? Was it a local flood that killed all the people that lived in that area? Lots of discussion back and forth. But be that as it may, there is a common outlook of a large scale flood in the ancient Near East, not just in the Hebrew Bible, but in other cultures as well. Now, we also have climate change, and that's not just a modern concern for us. Archaeologists have been able to match several severe drought periods with times of urban collapse, with times where cities have just kind of fallen into disrepair. They've been abandoned. And really, if you look at it, it's going to be hard to live in a big city when there's no water and nothing to eat. So what we see here is this is a chart based on the carbon-13 levels of barley grains that have been recovered through archaeology throughout the Near East. Carbon-13, if you recall, in our first session, we talked about some of the stable isotopes. Carbon-13 is going to be an isotope that's present in plant life, and it indicates the amount or degree of water that this plant, in this case barley, had when it was growing. So it can give you a general sense of whether water was plentiful or not. So you get a notion of the drought condition. So again, if we're going to make an assumption here, but if we're going to assume that the chronology that we were discussing that puts Abraham and the other patriarchs into the Middle Bronze Age, we see here in this central portion with all the red, this is from the Middle Bronze Age. This shows the most severe drought. And if we look in the biblical account, we're told that there was famine in the time of Abraham. That's in Genesis 12. Famine still or again in the time of Isaac in Genesis chapter 26. And also severe famine in the time of Jacob and Joseph in Genesis chapter 41. Famine and drought so severe that it caused the family to relocate into Egypt. And really, that kind of pressure led to large-scale migrations. These challenges in this particular time period, and most of them were climate, but not all, would cause significantly widespread movement of people groups and families, tribes, and that movement was generally going to be from the east to the west. Now we have a map representation of Abraham's journey from Ur of the Chaldees all the way into Canaan, and this is probably a very similar track that would be taken by other people who would be going from the east to the west. You're normally going to see this generally northern pathway that comes up and over the top and then back down into the Levant, into Lebanon, Jordan, modern day Lebanon, Jordan, Syria, and Israel. They wouldn't cut across this middle portion here because that was very rugged land and very dry desert type land. So this would have been an ordinary kind of migration for the time period that we hear in the account of Abraham. We also know from the archaeology that there were records from several large cities of the Middle Bronze Age that comment on all these pastoral people, all these nomads who are kind of coming through the area and moving further in. We will see that the continued drought conditions created a lot of pressure, making this a large scale movement that eventually pushed people all the way, just like Jacob and Joseph pushed a lot of Semitic people into Egypt, which was generally always, I won't say it was immune from famine, but because of the Nile and the yearly flooding of the Nile, it generally was less affected by climate type changes. And that's going to eventually bring us to a discussion of the Hyksos. And so, speaking of the Hyksos, we'll talk a little bit about Joseph and the role that the Hyksos may have played in his time in Egypt. If we look again at that dating assumption we've made with Abraham and kind of tack on a few lifespans past that, that generally will put Joseph in Egypt in the time frame that coincides with what's called the Hyksos pharaohs. Now, the Hyksos means foreigner in Egypt, and the Hyksos time frame was a point where so many Semitic people from Canaan and that general side of things had migrated into Egypt that they ended up taking over the entire government of Lower Egypt. And so these Semitic people became Egyptian pharaohs. We don't know a whole lot about the circumstances. There's a lot of argument about whether it was a peaceful takeover or a warlike takeover, but we do know that for about 150 years, there were non-Egyptian pharaohs who were ruling Lower Egypt, the area around the Nile and there around the Mediterranean. So we will talk a lot more about the Hyksos in the next session, but let's just suffice it to say that Joseph, being a Semite and a pharaoh who also would have been a Semite, makes it a lot more reasonable for us to see the fast rise that he makes and all the success that he has in his career in Egypt's administration. So moving out of the synchronisms, we get to the culture. And remember, we talked about cultural synchronisms. This is quite important to us, especially, well, it's important to us in understanding the setting of the biblical accounts, but it also is important to us when you see a great deal of the criticism that says, oh, the biblical accounts were written much after the time periods that they describe. If we find true to life, authentic cultural aspects described in these accounts that are not part of later time periods, then we can start to feel a little bit more confident that these accounts were probably written down at the time they occurred. And so we're going to look at a few of those synchronisms and hopefully see some aspects of that. So first off, we look at treaties and agreements. So this can also be called covenant language. We find agreements or treaties that were made by Abraham in Genesis 21, by Isaac in Genesis 26, and by Jacob in Genesis 31. All of these treaties, all of these agreements or contracts that were made with another individual, they all match the general form and the general content that you find in Middle Bronze Age treaties or contracts. And we found several examples of these kind of treaties and contracts that have been recorded in the archives of Mari and Tel Leland. So they have a certain format. They start off with a prelude, and they talk about the different parties. They give the terms of the agreement. They have blessings and curses. Blessings if you follow up on what you're supposed to do. Curses if you break the agreement. And it's very much in a formulaic fashion. And these agreements that we see in the book of Genesis follow that same content of Middle Bronze Age treaties very closely. And it's also noteworthy to find that where we have found examples of early Bronze and late Bronze Age treaties, they do differ. So you can tell the difference between an early Bronze Age and a Middle Bronze Age agreement, and a Middle Bronze and a late Bronze agreement as well. So it serves as a great cultural specificity to put us in a general time frame of these events occurring. Now, also, we've probably all read through the accounts in Genesis and thought to ourselves, "Wow, some of these customs are pretty out there. They're kind of crazy. It doesn't make a lot of sense." And we find from the archaeology that a number of these odd inheritance customs of the early Old Testament are really rooted in customs and law of the time. For example, in Genesis 15, we have Abraham, who is childless, making his servant, his slave, Eleazar of Damascus, his heir. Eleazar is going to inherit all of Abraham's goods. This same type of thing, making a slave or a retainer your heir, is found in the Code of Hammurabi in the old Babylonian society, and also in the laws of Mari, which is in the northern Levant. Also, we see on a couple of different occasions, Genesis 16 with Sarah and Genesis 30 with both Rachel and Leah, that you could, if your wife was barren, you could produce an heir by the slave of your wife. And this same custom, this same legal protection, is found in the Code of Hammurabi, again in the Babylonian societies. It's found in the Nuzi tablets and the Anatolian Kanesh. So these are all things that would definitely be odd to us in the current day, and I think we're odd even probably a few hundred years later, but we're very much a part of the culture at that time frame. Now, this one is perhaps my favorite. We see throughout the Pentateuch the mention of camels. Abraham has camels. Isaac has camels. There's a discussion of camels in terms of the story of Joseph. How is this a challenge, or how is this a cultural type issue? Well, camel domestication has been a bit of a hot button topic in the scholarly debate. There was really, and still really is, widespread dismissal of camels actually being domesticated by the time frame of the Genesis accounts. Many scholars will tell you that the domestication of camels in the Levant couldn't have been any earlier than about 1000 BC, which that's going to be much too late for the time of the patriarchs by at least 500 to 800 years. So that's definitely a problem if the Bible's talking about camels being domesticated. But we have here in an inscription in Aswan, just outside of Cairo, that's been dated to about 2200 BC. You can see that you have an individual who seems to be leading a camel by a bridle. Also in Wadi Nazib, which has been dated to sometime around 1500 to 1200 BC, you see something similar to that, where it looks like someone is leading a camel. And finally, we see also here in a Syrian cylinder seal, you find there in the circle in the red, you find two figures riding a camel, and this particular cylinder seal has been dated to about 1800 BC. So there's significant evidence that would indicate that there was some level of use or domestication of camels, even at a much earlier age, that would put them in a standpoint that would be appropriate to the time of the patriarchs. And now I'd like to finish up with a discussion about the price of a slave, and we'll talk about this a couple of times during the course of our discussions of the Bible and archaeology. So this is just the first time, but we do know in Genesis 37:28 that Joseph's brothers sold him to Midianite traders for the sum of 20 shekels. What we may not recognize, but what scholars have determined, is this is the same approximate price for a slave that is listed in the Babylonian Code of Hammurabi, which is dated to about 1750 BC. And we're assuming the time of Joseph is somewhere in maybe the 1600, 1500 time frame. So generally about contemporary. We also know from the city of Mari, which is ancient Syria, this was very much of a commercial center, and most of the records that we have recovered from Mari are merchant records, and they show a lot of mercantile type activity, a lot of buying and selling. And so there are a large number of records of the sale of slaves, and they show prices from anywhere from about 15 to 30 shekels. And this is generally also about that same time frame. of particular note, when they kind of added everything up and took an average, that average ended up being right at about 22 shekels. So it would appear that the going rate for a slave in the time of the Middle Bronze, which is when the story was supposedly set, was 20 shekels, and that's the number that the Bible gives as well. So a nice cultural a nice cultural specificity there for us. So that finishes us up for the time of the patriarchs in Genesis. Again, we talk a little bit about references and additional information. These are references that we talked about before, but we have On the Reliability of the Old Testament from Kenneth Kitchen as an absolutely outstanding reference. He speaks a good bit to the specifics of some of our examples here. And then also, again, that popular treatment, Harvest Handbook of Bible Lands. Love it because it has so many great pictures, and also, for complete transparency, produced by Veritas International, which is the school that I'm attending right now. So we're finishing up here, and then we will in the next session we'll be talking about the Exodus and the conquest.